So today we're going to talk about Ocapi. Ocapi is it's a shortcut for Open Commerce API. It's a Salesforce API solution for internal and external applications. It's an HTTP request and returns usually a JSON response, but can be formatted to other things. The request construction and response consumption is completely up to the developer. So let me share my screen and show you where you can set up Ocapi in your business manager. So I'm going to be using Lancome a lot for this example, just because I know their Ocapi structure very well, and I've used their Ocapi system since the beginning. So you set up Ocapi on your sandbox or environment by going to Administration, Development, Open Commerce API Settings. In here, you have the ability to set what type of Ocapi endpoints you're trying to configure. There's three, which is Shop, Data, and Meta. And Meta API is not very used. I'll go over the three types shortly. So in here, you can choose also the context of what does this configuration entail. Are you doing it for a global setting, or are you doing it for a specific website? So let's go ahead and go to Lancome US. So once you go to setting, you see this is a big JSON object. And here you choose what kind of Ocapi is being used, the version, the client ID that is configured, the allowed origins that are allowed to access this Ocapi endpoint, and what are the resources available. Each resource has a certain specific job that returns certain data. Some of them may be authenticated, some of them may be available to the public, but most of these are very self-explanatory. For example, let's go to categories. This is a get method that will return all the categories, content search, custom authentication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can find a fully detailed, fully detailed explanation about each endpoint inside of the documentation side of the info center. It's called Open Commerce API right here, and you just choose which endpoint you want to investigate. Commonly Shop API resources, and then you can actually just expand them from here. And you'll see all your popular endpoints. And once you open one of them, it will show what each method, the method type, the description of the method, examples whatsoever. So we click here, and it will take you to the exact URL format that you're supposed to be going and using. Okay. So the Ocapi enables you to access resources using HTTP requests and response. Data is transported using header parameters. So 1 second, submit. Okay. So it uses HTTP requests and headers. To make a request to Ocapi, you need to add a client ID. As we showed the example above with Lancome, this is our client ID to access the environments. Now with sandboxes, you can also write 30 A's, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is your client ID for sandboxes as well. Sandboxes are not that very authenticated, not as important as production or staging environments. So with these, you can make the same exact request as any client ID. Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I have a question. Should I ask now or later?
Yeah, you can go ahead and ask now.
Yeah, so for the sandbox, should I add any configuration in the place, in the Ocapi settings in order to have it work on my end?
Yes. So you must have joined a little bit after. So let me repeat that section really quick. So in here, you go to Administration, Site Development, Open Commerce API Settings. You choose which type of Ocapi that you want to configure, and then you choose the context, which is also the website. You choose the website you want to add the configuration, and then you create this JSON object. And this JSON object, you choose the version of Ocapi, the clients that are allowed to access this Ocapi with origins, if you have languages whatsoever. The client ID, which has to be configured, and then what resources you want to be accessible. That is pretty much it. Read, write, etc.
Yes. Do you have a sample file that I can use in my sandbox for this? Is there something that I can add by default, or I need to write this JSON manually or somehow?
I'm sure there's some kind
Also,
of something in here. I'm more than happy to send you this default. I will hide the client ID.
okay.
I'm more than happy to send you this as an example. There's nothing
Okay.
secret in here except the client ID.
Okay, thank you. Just one more note, Sari. If you scroll up, the version here is not the Ocapi version. I think this is just misleading. I believe this is just the version of this file. I was actually, since I was learning Ocapi, soon I noticed this in Exchange, this information here that this version is not the Ocapi version. The Ocapi version is the
Oh,
one that is included in the URL. Just wanted to
oh,
correct
okay.
that.
Well, yes, thank you for correcting that. You're right. Actually, we started with 17.4 and then we updated it to 18 something in Lancome. And it just completely slipped my mind. So thank you for correcting that. So yes, so the version is not the version of Ocapi, but the version of this document, and then with the rest of the information. And I'll send you this after the call, and I'll remove the client ID. So as I was saying, the client ID can be the 30 A's. So we can see an example right here. Let me go to, so this is the Dev34 access shop API, endpoint for this content slot. And this is the actual client ID used for Lancome. If I request it, I guess they removed this one. Well, I mean, we see that endpoint is actually working, but I guess they removed this content asset. Now, if I report anything else, it will get mad at me and say client ID is not identified. So if we do 30 A's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think these are 30 A's, I hope so. There we go. If I put 30 A's, it gets a successful request. It's just that this content asset is not valid. For the sake of example, let's go ahead and find us a quick content asset so we can show this working. Okay, let's use this one. This is not allowed for the current client. I guess they might have removed the access for the content for Dev34. But anyway, usually this would work. And you would see this is working just because the actual client access is correct. Now, if I use another one, it will see the client ID as unknown. So that's why we have in the configuration, what is the client that is allowed? So if we go back to the original one, you would have this correctly requested. Now, this is a setup configuration from their side where the A's were disabled. That is unusual. So you can add the client ID by adding it through here, do xdw client ID as a header, request header, or you can add it as a request parameter. So you just write in here client ID, and then you add this just as a query request parameter, and it will work. Whoops. It will work the same way. You add query parameter, client underscore ID, and you add your client ID in the request. And that is how an endpoint is called. Okay, and as we saw, it comes back as a JSON document, and we can see a lot more examples in here. So, you can see this is the basket. You can see the client ID being sent, and you will see a very interesting structure JSON. And we'll go over more details about the response in a little bit. So Ocapi consists of 3 main types, which is Shop API, Data API, and Meta API. The Shop API is the more commonly used one for external access. For example, for Lancome, Mobilify lives outside of the Salesforce ecosystem, right? So this is an external application. So we have to access their information using their Shop API, which is the most externally available API because it doesn't have as much sensitive data as the other API. Now, the Shop API basically allows the client to interact with the system as a shop customer or as an agent shopping in behalf of the customer, which means that me as a customer, I can get all this product listing information by just, requesting the category. This is a category which I request by, searching for categories and then the category ID. And it'll get me back all the information that has this category has in the setup. Same thing with product search information. I get all the hits for these products, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this information is not actually a secret, right? If a regular customer goes to the website, he can see all this information, well, most of this information already, by just navigating through the website. Now, the Shop API allows you to get this data in a more formatted, organized way. You have all the information, not just, well, a big portion of the information, not just what they'll show you. And you can show that how you want on your website. And that's where the Shop API comes in handy. Now, when interacting with the system, you can interact as a guest. You do not have to be authenticated in most of the requests. For example, as we saw in content assets, you do not have to be authenticated to get a lot of these requests like content assets. Content assets just provides, you know, some kind of HTML or some kind of information, and that's not really that important for them, so they don't authenticate it. Now, there are other requests that require you authentication. For example, so whenever you run an application, one of the first things that we do, we request this authentication, whether you are a logged in user or not. So we send an auth request to the endpoint customer's auth that returns back the post request, that returns back with the type session that returns back what kind of customer are you. In our guest, we're just a guest user. We're not logged in whatsoever. Now, if I was logged in, it will return back whatever custom configuration that we have, custom ID information, all that kind of good stuff. So this will help in custom implementations. For example, if your website has, you know, a beauty profile or a customer profile that shows recommended products based on your profile, you can store that in your user profile in Ocapi, and you can return that as a custom attribute. Excuse me. Usually in the response, if it's C underscore whatever value, C underscore value, that means this is a custom attribute that you set through the code and return back through the Ocapi response, and that's why you see C underscore. Now, once the response is returned, it comes back to us with a JWT token, which is I think it's a JavaScript web token or something like that. JSON web token, sorry. I think that's what it stands for. But it's a JWT token, which is a bearer token, and this is your authentication token. You use this auth request basically to get this information. Without this information, a lot of these authenticated requests won't work without it. For example, basket requests, to get the basket information. You will need to be authenticated to get basket information. Without this, it will start yelling at you and it'll give you a 403 or something of a kind. Now, with this bearer token, usually in a lot of cases, in front-end applications at least, you will store it in some kind of, session storage, a browser storage of some sort, and you store it in there. Now, if you're using this directly through your backend, directly through Salesforce, you don't have to worry about the bearer token because you are already in the system. And you don't usually use Shop API while you're internal in the system just because you already have access to all your data already. Now, if you're trying to access more detailed information using the Shop API, you can use an Oauth token, which is basically your login information from the business manager. This is not good practice because this information, front-end information, is always available publicly. Yes, this is uglified code. Yes, this is minified code. But if someone spent enough time, he can find the whole environment list and client ID list publicly available. So if you have your business manager login information in your source file right here, someone can spend enough time and find that business manager login and create you a lot of trouble. So that's why we use JWT instead. And that really covers Shop API. I'll go over more examples later, but basically just, as I explained earlier, in here you can define a list of all your endpoints and what you can use them for. Stores, session information, product information, search suggestions, all kind of good stuff in here, while none of this information is secret without using the JWT token. Now, the second one is a data API. Data API is more used for internal applications. It usually provides access to digital applications, configurations that integrate functions per object basis. So, for example, one of the cases we try to use data API for is content slots. A lot of websites use content slots to set up, timed banners or timed implementations of something they want to be showed, at a certain time or for a customer group. In Lancome, they use this to show banners. For example, this can be configured to show from Monday to Tuesday, and then after Monday to Tuesday, the ones automatically disappear. And they do that with content slots. That's something you can't do with Shop API. So which is one of the hiccups a lot of external applications have with Shop APIs in Salesforce, because almost every single website uses content slots to do scheduled setup for their website. So that's where the data API comes in handy, but there's a lot of security concerns that come in there. The data API provides a much more secured access, much more access to secured data for the Salesforce website. As you see, there's a lot more endpoints. You can access custom objects, coupons, promotions, catalogs, content slots, all the site's important secured information. And to get access to data API, you basically have to put an Oauth token or an actual business manager login. For example, the login that I put in here, you would have to put the same user account to access data API, or using Oauth token, which is not good practice, because what if someone finds the user and password from this publicly available front-end code and then logs in and ruins the whole website? And that is why we don't give external access to this. And one of the projects I was working in the past, someone provided wrong access data API, and it was a huge deal because, again, this is public information. You can access inventory lists, you can access promotion setup and change them just using the data API. So then that will be, that will make you wonder, why would you use data API? You would use it for if you are a part of the organization itself and you want to do an automated scheduled job or data fetching, something that is outside of the Salesforce ecosystem, but you are in the network. You will use the data API, for example, to get inventory information and then, store them in whatever thing you want to store them in that is outside your Salesforce website. That is an example uses of it. Now, since we already have content slot access in here, we have access to slot configurations and campaign assignment search, slot configuration search, slot search, and slots, which is everything you would need to use for a front-end website. How do we go around finding slots without using data API? After 2 years of searching, we stumbled upon this little endpoint that is not documented, which I'll explain in a second, that provides you access to the system slots without using Ocapi at all. That's just an extra bonus feature for you guys. So you use this not documented endpoint to get exact content slot information. It will bring you back the content slot already parsed in HTML, just like how the desktop website receives it, just like how the native Salesforce receives it. This is a very direct endpoint because it goes with _system_slot and then your information. You actually won't find any documentation about this. This is not one of the best endpoints to use, but it can be used because it is not documented, which means this is an internal Salesforce demandware endpoint, which means they can change it without ever letting you know, and then your thing will break. But this is just a little extra piece of information in here. Okay. Now, if we move over to Meta API, it just provides meta information. It provides formal descriptions about resources and documents for Ocapi and endpoints used for Ocapi. That is pretty much everything there is about the meta. I haven't used it personally, but this is what it really stands for. Now, as we explained before, the Ocapi requires some sort of authentication, which is in most cases a client ID, and for secured endpoints, the JWT token. The HTTP header format for it is very simple. The HTTP format for it is you put, your HTTP secured or non-secured, your host, and then whatever clean formats alias of your website. You have to put the demandware, what endpoint you're using, shop or data or meta, the version of Ocapi that you are using, the resource you are using, products, baskets, content, etc., and then the actual value. This format usually does not change. The only part of it changes is after this little section, after what version of Ocapi you are using. This little section is the only section that will actually potentially change. And it will change based on whichever endpoint you want to use, based on this very detailed documentation. For example, categories. You can get one category, or you can get all the multiple categories. And as you can see, category request provides your JWT authentication. And if you scroll down, you can see an example usage of how you can request multiple categories and then an exact example response of that object. Now, how do you expand and configure Ocapi hooks? A lot of times, Salesforce Demandware will try to provide you with all the details that you need for your resource, right? For example, if you go to a product, right? So this is a product. If you go to a product, you'll see there's already a lot of information. But let's ignore the C underscore section for a second, right? And your website has a specific way with variations whatsoever. This is the information that comes out of the box with Demandware. Now there's some more that you can show and hide, but this is the general default one. What if there's more stuff that you want? How do you add that? That's where the custom attributes come in handy. Now, yes, someone else is joining. So yeah, so adding these additional, so this information is very useful, but what if you want to add more? You set those by using something called Ocapi Hooks. Ocapi Hooks is your best friend whenever you want to expand an already existing Ocapi endpoint, or you want to create your little own endpoint. So you can configure this piece of functionality however you want, basically. So let's look at an example in here. If this lets me open it. Oh, there we go. Let's look at this little example right here of how you configure your hooks. You go to your cartridge, your repository, your cartridge, and then you go to hooks.json. In here, you add a list of all the hooks you want to modify. Now, if anything is written in the format as in DW Ocapi and then basically the name of the actual endpoint, that means you want to modify the same endpoint that is actually set up by Ocapi. For example, Ocapi Shop API product search. This is an actual endpoint by Ocapi, and we can see the example right here. Product search is an actual endpoint. Now, why would you call the same one? You would call the same one because you want to expand on it. You want to add to the response that already comes out of the box. Another example is if you want to create your own custom endpoint, you will just name it whatever you want to name it, right? And you just create your new available endpoint. You can call this endpoint by importing your hook manager and doing a call hook. Call hook, you will just add in what is the endpoint you are calling, what is the function that is being called, and then any extra parameters you want to pass. And that way, that's how you call your Ocapi endpoints internally. Now with externally, just like we showed before. Now let's take a look at an expanded Ocapi endpoint. We're using, as you can see in here, the product endpoint, which is the example that we have shown in the Lancome website. So in our case, we wanted to know what is the default product, the default variation of this master product. So this is them accessing the endpoint, and then you do any kind of logic, any kind of business logic you want, and you pass it into the document. You pass in what is the variable name, what is the new attribute you want to show, and what is its value, and you just return the status of your endpoint. And that will return a brand new accessible endpoint. C underscore product default. If we go to our little endpoint right here, as you can see, this is a product endpoint, product, and then the product ID. And then as you can see in here, this is the master product. And then we have a brand new custom attribute called C underscore product underscore URL, or C underscore product underscore default variation, which is the one that was added, the two actually that were added right here. And that's how we got this new custom attributes. Now, one thing, before you go in and start expanding hooks, you got to make sure the hook is not already expandable. Now, what this means is if you go back to the product endpoint, for example, you'll see in here it has, go to this one, you'll see in here it has an expand query parameter. The expand query parameter allows you to expand any of these predefined set of values, which is availability, bundle products, links, promotions, options, images, etc., etc., etc. If the thing you want is not available through this expand query parameter, that's when you go in and custom add your Ocapi hook. And that really summarizes it all. Now, of course, whenever you're setting up your site, your site settings, you want to make sure you set it up for all the environments, and you got to make sure of your read and write attributes, especially if you're providing access for data API, which this should be empty, and it is not empty. So this should not be like this. Clients, data API should not have this kind of access available, especially if it's put in a non-dev environment. This dev environment, so it's not a big deal. But having it like this with a client ID, just 30 A's, and then with the write and read access, this is, major security concern because you can modify all this information potentially. So you got to make sure your configuration is not silly. And that really summarizes my little Ocapi presentation. Does anyone have any questions or anything I missed? Anyone want to add?
Amazing. This is actually very helpful information, Sari. Thank you very much for your time. So guys, do you have any question for Sari for what he has already presented so far? Okay, awesome. So if you guys have maybe any question in mind, later on, feel free to contact Sari over Slack. He's always ready to answer any question. And I would like again to thank you, Sari, very much for your time and for making the time and making this presentation today. We really appreciate that, buddy.
Of course. Anytime. Well, anytime you guys have any questions, just reach out to me and I'll be happy to help. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.